Yeah. Uh,
Do you?
Let me start by welcoming everybody to this seventh webinar in our webinar series of 2020. And today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Elisabeth Goffeng, who is a researcher with the National Institute of Occupational Health in Norway. And she will say some few words about what she does. Dr. Goffeng was one of our guest speakers in last year's conference in Mombasa, and we were very happy to have her she came to Mombasa together with her husband, Dr. Goffeng, Lash Goffeng, and we are happy to have her today here with us, where she will talk about safe shift scheme, work hours, employees' health, and safe performance. Was something else I wanted? Yeah, this is one of our aims, OSH Pro Services, to bring new knowledge of what is happening in occupational safety and health. So we want to bring new knowledge so that people know what is moving around the world, and this is one of the opportunity. And we're glad that Dr. Elisabeth Goffeng agreed to come and be with us this evening. So welcome, Dr. Goffeng, and we look forward to be enlightened from your presentation this evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, the development of the 24-hour society all over the world has called for increased flexibility, increased use of night and shift work, and increased use of extended working hours. Insufficient time for recovery between shifts or working periods is definitely problematic. Be the most consistent pathway from long working hours to adverse safety and health problems. The organization of working hours influence both our biological and social rhythms. Sleep, recovery, and circadian rhythms are highly influenced by the organization of working hours. Work-related fatigue, which is defined as an extreme tiredness and reduced functional capacity, is a problem in combination with extended work hours. It has been identified as a contributing factor for accidents, injuries, and death in a wide range of settings. And fatigue may occur when there's inadequate time to rest and recover during and after a work period. Workplace accidents in safety critical jobs may, in addition to being detrimental to the worker, also harm third parties, like in transport sectors, in the transport sector, where it could harm the passengers and patients in healthcare sector. So I work at the National Institute of Occupational Health in Norway. SLAMI is a research institute which is funded by the Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs. And our aim is to convey scientific knowledge on occupational safety and health to the social partners in Norway. We also study different exposures in occupational health and effects, different exposures, just like chemical exposures, working time arrangements, to mention some vibrations is another one. And we study these and the association on detrimental. It's shown in a recent review from Keklund and Andersson that there are a considerable number of studies that document negative impact on non-standard working time arrangement regarding sleep, fatigue, performance, and safety. So if there is an association between extended work hours and risk of cardiovascular disease, A study by Virtanen et al. Virtanen is a Finnish researcher, shows that more than 48 hours a week is associated with a 27% increased risk of stroke. And if you work more than 50 hours a week, there's a 40% increase of cardiovascular disease in general. So the acute effects of extended work hours, both daily and weekly, are fatigue. And in the longer term, it's cardiovascular disease. According to recovery theory, accumulating of fatigue over time, it leads to wear and tear on the body's physiological responses and functions, which again can lead to cardiovascular disease. And it is well known that an association between night and shift work and sleep disorders, reduced function and safety, and cardiovascular disease exists. And extended workdays showed an association between reduced function and accidents. A recent review of research suggests that shift workers have a 40% increased risk of cardiovascular disease. The causal mechanisms aren't well defined, but contributing factors include disruption of the circadian rhythm, disturbed social temporal patterns, and social support, stress, and then smoking, poor diet, and lack of exercise. And the health outcomes are mainly angina, hypertension, and myocardial infarction. However, if the work is easy and the workers have a high degree of control over the work hours, breaks, speed, and strain, it's reasonable to assume that they may handle 12-hour shifts. The most serious problem then is the short time for rest and recovery between the shifts. And because of that, it's not recommended to have more than 2 consecutive extended shifts, followed by 2 days off. Theoretical models for the mechanisms behind the shift and behavior associated with shift work and an increased risk of chronic diseases and injuries is shown in this picture. The model assumes that the shift work increases the risk of chronic diseases and injuries through behavior leading to circadian rhythm disorders and sleep disturbance. So our bodies, or our normal body functions, follow regular circadian rhythms that fit with activity in daylight and with repair and sleep during the night. They're interconnected and they're subject to the biological clock. I mean, body temperature is highest during the day when our activity level usually is highest. Urine production is low at night, but it picks up in the morning. And also the hormone melatonin increase in the evening hours and makes us sleepy and ready for bed. And of course, vulnerability to disease and the effect of medication also varies with the time of the day. The systems for absorbing and converting energies and meals are most effective in the afternoon and least effective at night. So when you're evaluating a shift scheme, which is important to do, there are 4 important factors that you should consider. And that is, first, the length of the shift, and then the time for rest and recovery between the shifts. And you have to consider if it's a night or an evening, a day or a night shift. And it's also important to consider if the shift scheme could lead to sleep deficit. And that is both the quality of sleep and the duration of sleep. Both can be affected by the way the work is organized. With age, the physical endurance becomes smaller, and extended shifts may be a bigger problem for elderly workers. The workload that you cope with as a 25-year-old may be 8 hours and maybe only 6 hours when you turn 60. Of course, there's wide variations when it comes to this, but in general, it's definitely so that you can cope with fewer hours when you're older. Women have an average less physical endurance than age-matched men, but also here you'll see variations. Another thing is that if the employees themselves want extended long shifts in order to obtain longer leisure time, the results can be more positive than if they do not have any long shifts. So a strong motivation may weigh up for a lot of discomfort. Even if you're well rested when you start work, the risk of work accidents and errors will increase with the length of the shift. So the risk increases much faster than the increase in shift length, and is due to the mental and physical fatigue that is building up. This study by Folkard and Lombardi shows that after 8 hours at work, the risk of malpractice and injury increases dramatically, as you can see by the blue arrow. The advice given is to avoid adding difficult tasks, work tasks that require concentration to these hours, but it's a good question if that's possible in our working life. Finally, on an anecdotal note, it's interesting that some of the major catastrophes, such as Chernobyl, the Exxon Valdez, and the Space Shuttle Challenger that exploded just after takeoff, all of them started in the early hours of the morning with errors by people who had been on duty for a very long time. The graph here shows how the risk of accidents and mistakes increases for every hour that goes from the shift start. The blue line marks the risk of 8 hours that we compare with the reference. So when the shift length increases from 8 to 12 hours, the risk is doubled. But this is an average. Some are tired already after 4 to 6 hours and get a steep increase even earlier. And other people are perhaps not tired until after 10 hours. So only then the increase in the curve shows. So another way of showing that there are great individual variations. Just as athletes are unable to compete every day, many workers have such strenuous work that even the time for rest until the next day is too short for them to be rested. And fatigue is a result, and it's a condition where you cannot or just will not continue with what you're doing, usually because you have been it for too long. And fatigue may be due to lack of sleep. It could be the wrong time of the day, or great mental and physical workload without adequate rest or breaks. And such fatigue affects reaction time, alertness, and problem solving, and also collaboration with colleagues. And the consequences in the work situation may actually be fatal. Here you can see this is based on data from 7 different studies in the mining industry, and you can see that the risk of occupational accidents increases from shift number 1 to shift number 4, and particularly the risk is higher during the night shifts. This is also a study by Folkard and Lombardi from 2006. So the next thing you have to consider when you evaluate your shift schemes is the time for rest and recovery. During recovery, the psychophysiological systems that has been deranged during work unwind to and stabilize at baseline level of activation. So thus, recovery represents a process in which sleepiness and fatigue are reduced and circadian rhythms are restored again. However, if working extended shifts, the time to recover between 2 consecutive shifts may be insufficient, leading to an accumulation of sleepiness and fatigue throughout the working period, and with a spillover into the subsequent working period, or at least into the subsequent period of time off, but also sometimes into the next shift period. This is a study of quick returns. This is a study of 1,900 Norwegian nurses, where they found an association between quick returns, which was less than 11 hours between the shifts, and insomnia, excessive sleepiness, extreme fatigue, and sleep disorders. This was a study that was conducted by Eldevik in 2013. This is more details from that study. It shows that sleep is vital. Sleep increases our resistance to infections and other illnesses, and it's important for memory and learning ability. Lack of sleep may actually aggravate pain and carries the same risk as unhealthy diets and little physical activity for obesity, cardiovascular diseases, and also diabetes. So shift work and night work are associated with the same disease risk as lack of sleep, and the mechanisms behind it may be the same as well. Normally, we fall asleep in the evening after 15 to 16 hours of waking period. And at the best, we sleep 7 to 9 hours, probably average it's 8 hours. And it pays off to go to bed in the hours before midnight, even if it's hard sometimes, because then it is easiest to fall asleep. And we have enough time to sleep before daily rhythm awakens us to a new day and a new working period. So the systematic review of the relationship between quick returns in rotating shift work and health-related outcomes show that quick returns have a detrimental effects on acute health problems. However, the evidence regarding effects on chronic health is a bit more inconclusive. The next thing you have to consider is what kind of a shift it is. Is it a day or is it a night shift? As I said earlier, the organization of working hours influence both biological and social rhythms. Sleep, hormones, recovery, and circadian rhythms are highly influenced by the organization of the work hours. Working nights, early mornings, and late evenings may cause disruption of the normal circadian rhythm. The circadian rhythms are generated by endogenous oscillators to allow organisms to change their behaviors within with a period of 24 or 25 hours in anticipation for the changing environment of day and night cycle brought about by the Earth rotation. Excuse me. So actually, night work desynchronizes the biological clock. It messes it up. One of the most important physiological problems associated with shift work and the night shift in particular is that working, eating, and sleeping phases are changed. And mammals in general have a natural rhythmicity to many bodily functions, and these circadian rhythms exists in humans as well, with many operating on a 25-hour cycle, not 24. Such free running cycles, which includes body temperature, respiratory rate, and urinary excretion, cell division and hormone production, can be modulated by exogenous factors such as light-dark cycle, social climate, and of course, work schedules. For example, under normal living conditions, the bodily temperature peaks in the late afternoon, and it has its lowest point in the early hours of the morning, during the time of, or the window of circadian low between 4 and 6 in the morning. It is, under experimental conditions, it is possible to reverse this cycle, but rotating shift workers usually only succeeds in flattening the curves. Body temperature is often used as a surrogate measure of disruption of circadian rhythm, but it's probably too simplistic to link this measure directly to performance. I'm going to show you some pictures from a study of simulated tasks in security in an airport. These people were shown 5,800 pictures of simulated x-rays of cabin luggage, and 25% of them were containing a knife or a pistol. What they studied was the target rate, T, the false alarm rate, FA, and accuracy. So the result was that during night shift, they found a significant reduced accuracy rate. They found a significant increased false alarm rate. And after a sleepless night, after the whole shift, they'd been working for a whole night shift, they were tested again, and the findings were a significant lower target rate. They didn't see the pistol or the gun or the knife, and it was a significant reduced accuracy. This was a study that was done in 2008, and it's quite an important study because we kind of trust that people in the security in the airports, they find what they're looking for. This is actually a very old classical study, which is it's done in a Swedish gas plant. And I think the numbers are actually from the 30s, 1930s, but this study is done in 1955. And the curve shows the number of errors when reading the gas meter during 24 hours. They read the meter every hour. And the data, is from a gas plant. And what you see is that there's an increase in the afternoon, a bit after 2 o'clock. There's an increase in errors. And then you see a fairly steep curve showing that the number of errors were fairly high between 2 and 4 in the morning. This study has later been replicated in other industries, and they've seen exactly the same. And that's important to think about when you do night duty, and what kind of is, if the work you're doing in night duty is safety critical, this is very important to take into consideration. We also know that traffic accidents actually occur most frequently at night time. You may see that I have a background from the airline business seeing these pictures. This is a study done with 17 Australian short-haul pilots. And they reported that tiredness was most pronounced in the shift starting between 4 and 5 a.m. in the morning. And it was least pronounced in shifts starting between 8 and 9 a.m., which is not really very surprising. But the thing that is important to consider when you have these very early shifts is that 15 minutes of sleep is lost for every hour the shift starts from before 9 a.m. As I mentioned earlier, sufficient sleep is vital. Night workers are often advised to sleep in the afternoon before the first night shift, which is a very good idea to avoid a long continuous period without sleep until the next morning, but it's not always easy. So it ends up with quite a few people doing night duties without having had an afternoon nap before they go to work. And everyone can tolerate a sleepless night, you know, at times. Most people do, but it becomes harder to concentrate the next day, and your mood is not the best. And such problems, they accumulate if you accumulate sleep deficits over time. For example, due to multiple night shifts or multiple early morning shifts in a row, which is not to be recommended either. So sleep disorders is actually the single factor that has the greatest impact on shift workers. Perhaps the most authoritative review concludes that despite considerable variation between people, sleep loss is a major effect of shift work. And this is most noticeable after night shift. The quantity of sleep may be reduced by up to 2 hours a day, but there's also an effect on the quality of sleep after night duty. So the rapid eye movement, the REM sleep, and stage 2 sleep have been shown to be reduced. And such sleep deficits may lead to extreme sleepiness during work, with some data showing that inadvertent napping at work or microsleep may be the result. Overall, the effect of shift work has been linked to a long distance traveler working in San Francisco and returning to London for his time off or any rest days. This is a study by Lombardi et al. That was done in 2010, and it shows the amount of sleep you get and how it's associated with the risk of occupational accidents. It's a US study, this. And the U-shaped distribution you see, after controlling for the number of work hours, shows that people with short sleep duration were at higher risk than the reference group, which is having a sleep of in between 7 and 8 hours. And why it's so high after 10 hours plus, I can't explain. There's a similarity between being influenced by alcohol and judgment and performance, which is important to notice. It shows that after 22 hours of wakefulness, which may be a fact after night duty, if you haven't had any afternoon sleep the day before, your per mil alcohol level or your judgment can be compared with having the judgment of having 0.08 per mil of alcohol in your blood. So what may happen is the microsleep. That actually is the sleep takes command over your body. The body may handle deficits in sleep, in the sleep accounts by microsleep. The snooze lasts only for a few seconds, and you don't even notice that you haven't disconnected. The driver who ends up in the ditch, or the doctor who ignores an alarm, does not even understand why it happened. I mean, people on the road, the driving becomes wobbly. You overlook red signals or stop signals. And if you sit in the control room, for instance, in a tower in the airport, microsleep will make you overlook signals that really required effort. And it happens whether you want or not. If you have to go to work when sleep deprived, you're not able to decide not to fall asleep. It's the sleep deficit that determines. It is difficult to assess how fit you are to perform dangerous work, drive a car, or to make difficult decisions. You know, the sleepiness you feel may not always match your performance. And it's easy for us to overestimate what we can do when we're sleep deprived. And those who drive home after a night watch or go to work after a short work-free period with little sleep may even think that the level of performance is on top. But the response time test will show that performance is worse than normal. For example, many people find themselves getting used to night work after the first hard nights. They do not recognize that the sleep deficit continues to increase and that the brain is functioning poorly. This what you see on the screen, it's a study of 35 subjects in the sleep laboratory where they were divided into 3 groups. They were given 8, 6, and 4 hours of sleep, respectively. After a few nights, the 2 groups with short sleep, 6 and 4 hours in bed, they were expecting sleepiness and did not notice any significant deterioration. However, when tested, they were tested, they would have to respond when a red dot became visible on a screen. It turned out that the number of error responses increased sharply for each night, and most among those who had only been given 4 hours of sleep. But they didn't judge themselves as particularly sleepy. "44% of the nurses in a Norwegian study, they reported of sleep disorders. These nurses were working at 3 shifts schedule. They had morning, evening, and night shifts. And 44% of the nurses working only night duty reported of sleep disorders. And that shows that there's a need to move the focus from the individual to an organizational level. When such a large proportion of shift workers experience sleep problems, it's timely to ask whether this is an organizational problem rather than the fact that employees do not cope with such a job or shift work. You also have individual coping strategies in shift work. It helps with, you know, having a healthy lifestyle, exercise, eating properly, and it's important to have a family, social network, and to have a positive attitude towards work. When going home after night duty, it's important to protect your eyes from sharp sunlight and dark bedroom during daytime sleep. And then again, a nap, if possible, before the night shifts. The Norwegian Labour Inspectorate, they recommend when you're looking and considering if the shift scheme is healthy, they ask you to consider a lower number of consecutive shifts or shorter shifts. They also suggest longer time for rest and recovery between the shifts. Forward rotating shift is to be recommended. It's also recommended to reduce the workload and look at the organization of the workday, and if necessary, increase the staffing. So safe shift schemes, to have safe shift schemes, you have to look at the type and intensity of the work. You have to have sufficient time for breaks. It is recommended to have several short breaks instead of one long break during a shift. And the breaks are particularly important for older workers. And then again, it's recommended to have sufficient staffing, which is kind of self-evident. And it's important to evaluate the shift plan as a whole. It's important to look at all these 4 factors that I've mentioned as a whole. And there's also a need for systematic efforts to improve the working environment. These are the recommendations of Peter Knaut, a shift work researchers that he has been studying shift work for many, many years actually. This is the recommendations he gave in 2006. So the organizational measures then for limiting risks of health and safety is to minimize sleep deficit and also minimize circadian rhythm disorders by including in the shift plan forward rotating shifts and minimum 11 hours between 2 consecutive shifts. And you should avoid extended weekends, and extended weekends is over 60 hours. I'd say that's too much in itself. And extended shifts should be avoided. Extended shifts is then shifts that goes beyond 10 hours. At the same time, it's important to offer employees a high control over the working hours and also regularly screen shift workers for clinical sleep disorders. These recommendations are from 2 Swedish researchers, also very experienced researchers when it comes to shift work, Keklund and Axelsson. And this is from these recommendations were given in 2016. So what about the optimal shift scheme? It doesn't really exist. It is dependent, the optimal shift scheme is dependent on the type of industry. It's dependent on the workplace and the workforce. And that's about all I have. Thank you very much. I'm open for questions. I can't hear anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I was speaking, and but something happened. I said thank you for the wonderful presentation on extended work hours and shift and the health outcomes of this. And your presentation made me think about something you mentioned. For example, like that the airport security is more lax, and there are more errors during the night. So it seems like traveling during the night at the airport is more risky than traveling during the day. Both when you have pilots who are tired and the security officers who cannot spot a pistol or a knife in hand luggage, it's very scary. And then the number of hours. You work 48 hours and you risk, you have 27% increased risk of stroke, or 50 hours and 40% increase of cardiovascular disease. These are very, very serious problems. So if you have any questions, please, you can put your question in the chat and we'll read it. Or if you'd rather speak, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you so that you can put forward your question. But I have, I can start with one question. It's a common practice in many countries that you work late and late shift, and you come home and sleep some few hours. You wake up, you're still tired, and you take a large cup of coffee and you're good to go. Does the coffee really helps in any way?
Coffee helps, definitely. It gets you started. But as the day goes by, you would feel the tiredness from lack of sleep. And it's in all the research I've seen, and when it comes to shift plans, it's recommended not to have an early morning shift after a late night or an evening shift. And particularly in the hospitals in Norway, they're trying now to avoid that. It's not possible to avoid it completely, but they try to avoid it as much as possible, so that a night shift is followed by another night shift, or an evening shift is followed by another evening shift, and then a night shift maybe after that, and then a few days off, and you can start on a morning shift. But the coffee helps definitely on a short term basis. I start with a cup of coffee myself every morning.
Okay. Okay, that's a bit consoling. At least the first few hours they help. So the idea is to avoid the shift. And please just write your questions if you have any. In the meanwhile, I'll take I'll make another comment from the notes I've been writing. You mentioned that when the workers have some control of how they work and the working hours, this helps a little bit. Can you elaborate on that? Should the workers decide themselves when they want to work and when they should stop?
There have been they've tried out that in Finland, where the workers may choose their shifts. They may choose to work maybe only morning shift and to avoid night shift. And there's a great variability among what people prefer. And also, as I said, the vulnerability to, for instance, night work is very different as well. It varies between people. And the being able to decide or to have a certain degree of control over your working hours is recommended, and they have very good results of doing that in Finland. It's a motivation. If you're motivated to do something, you can endure more. And the motivation is usually that you then get longer times off after a more intense working period. But of course, we know that when it's too intense, you have the risk of, or when it's too compressed, you have the risks of making errors, and then it's important to see how safety critical your job is. But it's definitely it means a lot to be in control, or to have to be able to influence how your shift schemes is going to be.
Is a question is posted, but it's exactly what you've just answered. But just to add on it, is it just the control of the shift they do, or the control of the entire work they do that helps in against the problem?
I don't know if there have been any studies on the type of shift you do, but there's definitely been studies on the type of work you do. I'm sorry. But there's definitely studies that shows positive effect of being able to choose your shift plan, or to have an influence, a certain degree of influence on your shift plan. But the type of work, well, if you apply for a job, you have to take the work that comes with it.
Okay, keep the questions coming. I have another one here. According to something you mentioned earlier, that for any shift starting before 9 a.m. in the morning, you lose 15 minutes of sleep.
That's right.
So should we go and tell our bosses that we should start working at 10 o'clock?
It's hard. I think that'll be hard, to be honest with you. But you have to consider the fact that you lose a bit of sleep if you have to get up early. And of course, the individual may do something about that by going to bed before the midnight hours, because then you also get the best quality sleep. But it's an idea. As I said, you can't you can't find the ideal shift plan, but you have to consider all these things that or at least the 4 points that I mentioned: the length of the shift, if it's a day or night shift, evening shift, if it's the whole shift plan would produce sleep deficits, and also how many shifts are you going to have in a row. So you have to kind of evaluate them as a whole. But of course, the very, very early morning shifts are not great for you. It's not great for your system. So I'd say that you shouldn't have so many of them in a row. As I said earlier, everyone can cope with some sleep deficit for a day or two, but not as a continuous kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. I have a comment here. Very good presentation. I would be interested to research more on this. Very good, Philip. But there's still a lot which we don't know about. Example is what we just talked about, that the control of which shifts is helpful, but how about the control of the work?
Yeah.
This is it's open for such research. So it will be nice, Philip, to get some research work going on this.
I can just briefly mention the study that I did for my doctoral thesis, where we studied airline crew and nurses. The nurses worked 14-hour shifts, 4 in a row, which is not what I would have recommended. But we didn't actually find any adverse effects. We studied their reaction times, their cognitive functioning, and we also measured the heart rate variability. But when we looked into what kind of work they had, they worked in a nursing home that was brilliantly, it was new. They had all modern equipment. There were a doctor full-time on 46 patients. There were only qualified nurses working there, and they had 7 patients per ward, which meant that they were almost 1 nurse to each patient. I think they had 2. And of course, working long hours then is not a problem, and it wasn't a problem to them. But if you do the same in a nursing home where you have 30 patients, maybe few nurses, it's a completely different story. So of course, the work you're doing, you know, what kind of work you're doing is very important. Like the airline crew, they didn't have that long hours, but they showed signs of fatigue by increased reaction times, and also did more mistakes, and had also a higher cardiovascular strain during the time, because they had a very an intense workload when they were at work. So of course, what kind of work you do means an awful lot. But as far as I know, I've given you the presentation, and you would find the references on the research. And if you do a search for the names of the researchers, you'll probably find a vast amount of studies on working time, because the studies I mentioned is done by researchers that have a long experience studying shift work.
And just to mention to all, the presentation and the recording will be available for all in our webpage. One more question, and this concerns doing different types of. If you have the normal working hours, and after that you go on and do your own private work, does this this also affect you, or it's only the work where somebody else is the boss? And
I think all work you do would affect you, but again, probably the motivation of doing your own private work when you left the other would probably kind of balance it a bit. But of course, work is work. So if you have an 8-hour job and then go on and work 6 or 7, 8 more hours, the risk of doing errors or making errors is increasing. And also the time then between the time for recovery will be reduced. So I wouldn't say that I would be would be very reluctant to to recommend that to anybody, even if I know that in some parts of the world it's necessary to make a living, but it's not great for the workers' health, and it's not great for the safety.
Yeah, we have another question here. What would you say about house helps in terms of shift, because they seem to have long days of work?
I think it's about the same for house helps than it is for other employees that they have, and house helps have fairly hard physical work, and if they work 12 to 14 hours, the time for you need time for rest as well. I mean, there's a reason why the slogan 100 years ago was 8 hours work, 8 hours leisure, and 8 hours for sleep. And that is to balance the day so that you have time for recuperation, which is not only sleep, it's also rest in your leisure time. I mean, your life is not only work and sleep. I mean, work is an important part of your life, and it's supposed to be a good part of your life, but you need time to rest in the afternoon before the sleep, which is to restore your physiological system for the next day.
Is there, I know you said the optimal shift does not exist, but is there a system where one can determine how many hours of rest one will need after doing a certain type of work? For example, industrial workers, maybe they need more time to relax than office workers. So is there a system where one can determine how many hours will be enough?
I don't know, to be honest with you, but I think actually the old slogan, which has been introduced to most of the world, is that you should work 8 hours, and then there's 8 hours for rest and 8 hours for sleep and restoration. I think that's a good thumb rule when you're making shifts or shift plans.
We are told a normal adult should take at least 6 hours of sleep.
Yeah, 6 hours is too little for
more than 8 hours. You pay overtime. Is that okay? Worker can only get up to 10 hours.
I mean, it's okay to pay overtime. It's okay to do overtime once in a while, but there should be an upper limit to how many hours you should be allowed to work for in a longer period of time, because it will wear you down. And also to be also, overtime is also very unpredictable, which is not great either. You need predictability to be able to have a social life, which is also important, you know, in combination with your work. So I mean, overtime is supposed to be used in a particular situation where the employer needs it, but I wouldn't recommend a lot of overtime. And I think, I mean, in Europe, or at least in Norway, I think there's a limit to how many hours of overtime you're allowed to have, and that is to protect the worker. I'm not quite sure of the exact number of hours, but there's definitely a limit to it.
So I think it's you cannot work for more than 60 hours.
Yeah.
It's not. It's against the law. Okay, more questions. Keep them coming. We have a few minutes. While we're waiting for one final question, I would like to give you some information about the next webinar that will be on 29th of this month, and we've invited Dr. Tutula Balfour from the Mineral Council of South Africa, and she will be talking about improving occupational safety and health together with social partners and employers, organizations, and authorities, and the workers themselves. So this is one of the things which Elisabeth mentioned earlier in her presentation about the cooperation between these three. So this will be the next topic, and it will be by Dr. Tutula Balfour from Mineral Council of South Africa. So another interesting webinar coming your way soon. So if you have one last question, we have about 3 minutes. So just put up your question, and we use the last minutes on that. Otherwise, I would like to thank all of you for your participation and for taking part actively by asking questions. And would especially like to thank Dr. Goffeng for this wonderful presentation and for her time. And we hope that when the corona situation is over and we resume our normal conferences, that she and her colleagues and friends will be visiting us again, like they did last year. We had planned for a conference this year, but because of the situation we are in, we could not cannot hold the conference. But plans are that once the corona situation is different, we are going to have our conferences. Dr. Elisabeth, you are welcome again to Mombasa.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would love to go back. It was a very interesting conference that we joined the last year.
So thank you very much. Are there any further questions? Now we have 1 minute, and I'll give the word back to Imran. Imran, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you again, Abdul Kadir. My part is the easy part, which is to thank everyone who took the time today to attend, and to thank our speaker for the day, Elisabeth. Again, to reiterate on what Abdul Kadir has said, I think we are very much looking forward to having you back in Mombasa, whether that will be next year or anytime soon. Other than that, I just wanted to again remind you guys, we will be sharing a recording of this webinar online on our YouTube channel, and then we will share that video as well as the presentation on our page www.oshproservices.org. And if for information about future webinars and future events and news and articles and all of that, there's a form on the same webpage where you can input your email and your name, and then you can subscribe. So please feel free to use that feature. Actually, I encourage it very much. I have nothing more to say except once again to say thank you everyone. Thank you, Elisabeth, and we hope to see you again soon. Okay, and good night, everyone.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice evening. We hope to see you again in our next webinar on 29th or 28th, sorry, of